Money. It's one of the leading causes of stress in a relationship. But what happens when debt enters the picture? Last time we went through 50 questions that Equifax recommends for couples and relationships. Last time we went through the section spending, saving, and budgeting questions. Today, our main focus is going to be debt and credit questions. The first question is, what are your credit scores? So a credit score is defined as a numeric value that ranges from 300 to 850, usually 850 be on the higher side and 300 be on the lower side, that basically determines how credible you are to lenders and how likely you are to pay back your debts. Alright, so how would I rate this question? I would actually rate this question as important. The reason for that is because based on your partner's credit score, you can actually determine how their habits are with credit. So essentially, usually a higher credit score usually tends to say about your partner that they have good credit habits, such as they pay their credit card on time, they make their mortgage payments on time, they pay their phone bills on time. Essentially, it tells you about a lot about your partner. Usually, if they have a lower credit score, it usually mentions that they don't have really great credit habits, such as having too much credit, spending too much on credit, or not paying back their debts. So that's why this question is very important. Alrighty, so moving on to the next question. Do you regularly check your credit reports and credit scores? So a credit report usually has there's a few major people out there such as TransUnion and Equifax. So basically, it just tells you a history of all your activity using your credit, such as your highest balances and things like that. How would I rate this question? I would say this question is not important at all. The reason for that is because in most cases, most people don't really check their credit score often unless there's major changes in their credit score. So essentially, like in most cases, people won't check their credit score unless they're going to go take out a loan for a house or for a car. It's not important to check your credit score regularly unless you feel like there's something that you've been doing wrong. But if you've been on the right track in most cases, then it's not something you have to check regularly, only once in a while. So that's why I feel like this question is not important at all. Alrighty, moving on to the next question. Do you know how your credit habits impact your credit reports and credit scores? Now, how would I rate this question? I would actually classify this as something that's very important. And the reason for that is because in a lot of cases, if your partner doesn't know how basically their credit their behavior determines their credit scores, then essentially they won't know how to build up a credit so you both can enter into, let's say, a mortgage or a car loan or these other aspects. Because in order to form good credit habits, you need to understand how each of your habits impacts your credit score. That's why it's important for you to ask your partner if they know, because if not, then you may need to teach them how they can have good credit habits. Moving on to the next question. How frequently do you pay for things using credit? So I would actually rephrase this question to actually say, what types of credit do you use to pay for things? So in most cases, depending on your spending habits, you may actually pay for things right away. For example, you might get a credit card and pay for the balance right away. Or if you're actually thinking of paying your balance little by little, then it's important to actually assess whether or not, maybe instead of using it on a credit card and let it ride on higher interest, you take out maybe like a personal loan, which tends to have 10 to 12% less interest than a credit card. So yeah, so this probably is a much better question overall. So how would I rate this question? I would rate this question as somewhat important. And the reason for that is because depending on the response from your partner of how frequently they use credit to buy things will actually determine, how much they actually spend overall. So in some cases, it's okay if, you use most of your credit all the time. You can finance most of your purchases through credit as long as, you pay it off each month. Or if you're responsible for your credit and make sure you make your payments on time. So depending on the spending habits of your partner, you want to make sure that they're not overusing their credit and using only credits for things that they actually need. Alrighty, so let's move on to the next question. How many credit cards do you have? So a credit card is a tool that most banks or other institutions actually give out to people. Usually it's a plastic card that, you use to actually spend. You could use it, to purchase things on credit, and it's usually one of the first tools that most people use. So how would I rate this question? I would say this question is somewhat important, and this can actually be taken in two different cases. So if your partner has a great credit score, let's say 750 to 850, then the more important question is, what types of credit cards does your partner have? So the reason for this is because different credit cards have different reward points, and depending on what activities you like to do, such as traveling, dining, or just like cashback and Bitcoin generation, each credit card will have its own function, and it's not a one size fits all for anyone. Now, if your partner's credit score is like 300, then it's very important for you to ask this question of how many credit cards they have, because what you don't want to see is for them to be maxing out one credit card and then jumping to another credit card until they have 12 to 15 credit cards and they're all maxed out, because this can have a big strain on your relationship, as you both will have to find a way to see how you pay that money back. So that's why depending on your situation, it can be pretty important. Alrighty, so moving on to the next question is, do you know the outstanding balance of each of your credit cards? So how would I rate this question? I would actually put this in the must-ask category. And the reason for that is because, if your partner doesn't even know how much balances they have on each of their credit cards, this actually makes them oblivious about how much credit they have at their utilization. So essentially, if they have a card with like $10,000 and they don't know that they've already spent $8,000 and they're at 80% utilization, or they've used 80% of their credit, then that can make them have more reckless spending habits. So it's important for a couple in a relationship to actually keep track of how much balances you have on your credit cards and other financial tools. That way you can control your spending and make sure that you're not going past your normal spending habits. Hello everyone, my name is Anthony and I'm the host of TheLostSanctuary. I hope you've been enjoying our content so far, and if you have, please feel free to like and subscribe. Also, we have our website up here, and we also have some socials down here. And as always, leave your comments down below. Moving on to the next question. Do you know when your credit card billing cycles end? Now, how would I rate this question? I would say this one is somewhat important, and it's more for like the credit score more than anything. And the reason for that is because depending on when your credit card billing cycle ends is when your credit card company will report your activity to the credit bureaus. So it's important to understand that usually 3 days after your closing statement ends is when your credit is reported to the credit card bureaus or the credit bureaus. So it's just TransUnion. So it's important to understand when your billing cycle ends. That way you pay it at least 2 or 3 days after, or at least 2 days after at most. That way you can maintain a healthy credit score and not have high balances reported to the credit bureau. So even though this level of precision may not seem important, in my professional experience, I've actually had cases where just because I paid 1 day after the cycle, I've had my credit score reduced by 60 points. Even though I was within my payment due date and everything, it was because I missed the 3-day window that my higher balance was reported to the credit bureaus, and then they effectively reduced the credit balance my credit score by 60 points. So that's why it's important to be precise of when you actually know when your billing cycle ends, so you can actually make sure you pay it no later than 2 days after the billing cycle ends. So that way you can maintain a great credit score. So moving on to the next question. How much do you pay in interest each month? So now let's define what interest is. So interest is basically the amount that you need to pay back to a financial institution. So let's go through an example. So let's say you take out $100 at 8% interest. if we do it over the annual term, then basically you'll be paying the $100 plus $8 of interest. So in total, you'll be paying back $108. But what's more important to understand about interest is how often does it compound? And because this will determine that if you actually pay interest, on your interest. So essentially, if, for example, if it's 8%, one twelfth of that is going to be effectively going on for month one, and then on month two, if the balance is still the same, you're actually going to have interest on top of your interest. So it's important to understand how often your interest compounds and what your interest rates is. Alrighty, so how would I rate this question? I would say that this question is important. And the reason for that is because you want to understand, not just how much dollars your partner has in interest, but what types of loans do they have that effectively generate this interest. Because depending on what types of loans they can have high interest loans that could range from 10 to up to 35% in rates. So essentially, it's important to understand, which loans they have and what type of methodology you want to use. The most common methodology is called the avalanche method, which effectively means you pay the highest interest rate loan and then you pay that off quickly. The reason for that is because this will reduce the amount of interest that you pay each month as you pay off these loans. So it's important to assess, these kinds of situations so that way you can mitigate the amount of interest you pay each month. Alrighty, so moving on to the next question. How much debt do you currently have? So, how would I rate this question? I personally would say that this is actually a must-ask question. And the reason for that is because you want to understand what types of debt your partner has, because, depending on the types of debt that they have can actually impede your future investments. So essentially, if your partner has too many, for example, bad credit card loans or personal loans or car loans, this can actually impact your ability to actually buy other assets such as houses, stocks, or whatever else you want to invest in. So it's important to assess how much debt your partner has, so that way you can create a plan so you can pay off this debt, so that way you can start investing in other tools that will generate you long-term wealth. So moving on to the next question. Do you owe money to friends or family? So how would I rate this question? I would say this question is a don't ask question. And the reason for that is because this will actually bring unnecessary drama to your relationship. So for example, if your partner is someone who has a great credit history, great credit score, they have great spending habits, then it doesn't really matter if they have debt with their family or friends, because they're going to pay it back. So it doesn't make sense to ask this question in that scenario. Now, if your partner has bad spending habits and has a terrible credit score, then most likely there's going to be a lot of telltale signs that they may have debt to their friends or family. And in most cases, you don't need to get involved in that because that's their business. And the only time that maybe you'll start to get involved is if, for example, maybe the family or friends start asking you for the money back. And even in that regard, you're already going to know that they do owe. What's more important to understand is, what are the debts that your partner has, and then pay off the ones with the highest interest and pay those off. Eventually, you'll reach the family and friends and be able to pay that back, so you can actually start to not just remedy your financial relationship, but your personal relationships as well. So moving on to the next question. Do you have a plan to pay off your debt? I would say this question is actually important. And the reason for that is because having a plan of attack of how to pay off your debts is important. So, there's different types of, methodologies that you can use to pay off your debt, but it's important to have a plan in general. For example, let's say you have a mortgage, you have a credit card, and you have a personal loan. It's important to understand, not just that you're paying each of them off, but also which one are you planning to pay off quicker than others. Because depending on which one you pay off quicker than others, will allow you to pay less interest in the long run, and will put a less of a financial strain on your entire relationship. So that's why it's important for you and your partner to have a plan of attack of how you're going to pay off your debts. Alrighty, so moving on to the next one. Have you ever fallen behind on payments for a loan or line of credit? So let's define what a line of credit is. So a line of credit actually has two different types of lines of credit. The first most common line of credit is a credit card. So essentially, when you take out a credit card, that's essentially a line of credit. Like effectively the bank is giving you access to a certain amount of credit that you can use. The second type of line of credit are used by businesses in most cases. And that's basically a revolving line of credit where you have access to a total amount of credit and then you pull from it as you need it. So it's similar to a credit card, except it's more money versus credit. So, how would I rate this question? I would rate this question as not important. And the reason for that is because you can kind of tell whether someone is behind on payments or not just based on their credit score. So essentially, if your partner has great spending habits, has a high credit score, in most cases, they're probably not behind on most of their payments. But if you see that your partner has bad spending habits or is struggling to make payments on time, just based on their credit score or their spending habits, then most likely you know that they're probably behind on a few of their payments. That's why this is something that could just be answered just by asking them their credit score instead of asking them this kind of question. Alrighty, so let's move on to the next question. Have you ever defaulted on a loan? So essentially, you were unable to pay your loan, whether it's your house, your car, or any other type of loan that you have, and they've taken back the asset from you and declared that you were insolvent or unable to pay. So let's actually couple that with question 15, where you say, have you ever filed for bankruptcy? Which is very similar, where essentially you have a high liability or high loan balance and it exceeds the amount of assets or the amount of things that you own. So in those cases, you would file for bankruptcy, which basically just means that you are insolvent or unable to pay. So you effectively, wipe out all of your liabilities. The only thing you can't wipe out, by the way, with bankruptcies are student loans and taxes, just for everyone's knowledge. So, how would I rate these two questions? I would rate question 13 and 15 as somewhat important. And the reason for that is because you need to actually assess where you are in your financial situation. So essentially, if your partner is currently in default or currently in bankruptcy, this can actually impact your overall financial plan because there are different steps that will have to be taken. So, for example, if they actually default on their loan or they do file bankruptcy, they can't get credit cards for 2 years, they can't get a mortgage for 5 years, and they effectively won't have the same credit score until 7 years. So this could actually impact any long-term goals that you guys have, such as getting a mortgage or getting a house and things like that. But if it's already occurred, so they already have been bankrupt or they've already defaulted on a loan, then it actually doesn't matter as much, as long as you see that their spending habits have changed after the fact. Because as long as they're striving to perfect their spending habits and getting a better score in the long run, then it's okay that this occurred to them, but it will be a blip in their credit, but will be erased after 7 years. So let's move on to the next and final question. Have you ever had to deal with debt collectors? So a debt collector is basically usually the last line of defense for most people that have debts with outstanding, with banks and other things, where effectively they send an agency or basically a collections agency to come after you to collect on the open balance. And debt collectors can come from like hospital bills, credit card bills, or any kind of debt that you have. So how would I rate this question? I would actually rate this one as not important. And the reason for that is because this can actually be attributed back to, your partner's habits. So usually people who have high credit scores and have great spending habits usually don't have debt collectors harassing them. However, if you have someone who has bad spending habits and a terrible credit score, in most cases you're probably going to see like mail coming from debt collectors. You're going to have a lot of signs that will tell you that your partner has someone that's coming after them, whether it's debt collectors or other agencies. And you probably even get calls. You get so many signs that you don't even need to ask your partner this question in honesty. So yeah, this is my honest take on this. So we successfully have gone through the debt and credit questions. On next week's episode, we're going to go through the children and family questions. And then finally, we're going to go through the retirement and investing questions. I would like to thank everyone for joining me this week as we discuss, your relationships and finances. I hope everyone has a blessed day and adios. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing an amazing job, and I'm wishing everyone out there all the best. All right, until next time, adios.